Hello and welcome to Office Hours. I'm Abby Snyder, Associate Professor of Microbial Food Safety in the Food Science Department of Cornell University. And today we're talking Seafood HACCP. So I would like to welcome our invited speakers. Today we have Dr. Mike Ciaramella, a Seafood Safety and Technology Specialist at the New York Sea Grant and Cornell Cooperative Extension, and Eugene Evans, Supervising Food Inspector in New York State Department of Agriculture. Following their presentation, we'll open it up for Q&A with our expert panel, joined by Dan Milo, former food safety supervisor with Ohio Department of Agriculture turned food safety consultant, and we'll finish it up from there. So that is the game plan, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Great. Thanks, Abby. All right, I'm going to share. All right. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. Again, Mike Ciaramella, Seafood Safety and Technology Specialist with New York Sea Grant and Cornell Cooperative Extension. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit today or giving an overview of the Seafood HACCP regulation. For those who don't know, that's in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's Part 123. But before I jump into a review of HACCP and specifically going into the development and conducting of a hazard analysis to build effective HACCP plans, I want to touch on and introduce our Seafood and Aquaculture Office Hours, which this session is being in partnership with Cornell's Institute of Food Safety. But as a result of Governor Kathy Hochul's 2024 State of the State, which included an initiative entitled Launching New York's Blue Food Transformation, which led to the formation of the New York Seafood Interagency Work Group. And over the course of the year, the work group discussed a variety of barriers that were identified by the industry and coming up with various recommendations for addressing some of those barriers. One of those recommendations was the creation of industry virtual office hours on a variety of topics specific to seafood and aquaculture, including topics like Seafood HACCP, which we're going to talk about today. That report that was developed by that group addressing those various recommendations is available online and linked here. I also have the link to our seafood and aquaculture specific office hours, which will continue in addition to the Cornell's Institute of Food Safety office hours at various times over the course of the year. So if you want to visit that website, you can learn more about our first office hours, which took place in January, was an overview of seafood and aquaculture regulation in New York and the various agencies involved. And also find more about future office hour sessions, which are largely planned around industry need and feedback from you. So feel free to reach out with interest about topics you want to hear about. So with that, I'll jump into today's topic for presentation, which is Seafood HACCP. As far as what I'll touch on, I'll start with a very brief introduction to the HACCP rule itself. We'll jump into who must comply so you can understand who this rule applies to before we look closer at the process of conducting a hazard analysis, which is that key crucial first step in developing those HACCP plans. And then we'll look more at the importance and the impact of that hazard analysis on your operations before I pass the screen over to my colleague Eugene Evans, Supervisory Inspector with the Department of Ag and Markets, to give an update on some of the histamine guidance that has changed through the Food and Drug Administration recently. So starting off with a very general introduction to Seafood HACCP, again, that's in the Code of Federal Regulations, which houses all federal rules. In Title 21, which is specific to the Food and Drug Administration, and it is Part 123. That rule is separated into three components, subparts A, B, and C. Subpart A contains the general provisions. Those general provisions are the bulk of that rule and the main focus for today. Subparts B and C are commodity specific. So if you're working with smoked or smoke flavored fishery products or raw bivalve molluscan and shellfish, you can look at those specific commodity requirements there. As far as subpart A and these general provisions, there are several components to that, starting off with definitions. Whenever you're working with and looking at regulation, it's important to understand the terminology that's used throughout. So we're going to start in a second with some key definitions that you need to understand in order to understand who this regulation applies to. It also calls out the current good manufacturing practices as a requirement for all food production. Those are, while listed here in the Seafood HACCP rule, are housed in 21 CFR Part 117, Subpart B specifically. All of these links that you see on these slides, this is going to be provided as a PDF in the follow-up email to this webinar to all registered participants. So don't worry, you'll be able to link and access those at your leisure after today's presentation. 123.6 is our focus for today, which covers hazard analysis and HACCP plans. And then it has additional information in that rule itself on various components of the HACCP plan, such as corrective actions, verification records. It touches on the training requirement. So there's a training requirement for those developing HACCP plans, reviewing HACCP plans, as well as reviewing records associated with those plans. And lastly, has a section on sanitation control procedures, as well as special requirements for imported products. But again, our focus today is really on that hazard analysis. As I mentioned, that's that initial step in terms of before you develop that HACCP plan. So the HACCP rule is important because any fish or fishery product processed or imported in violation of this rule can be considered adulterated and thus subject to regulatory action. Right? So we really want to understand whether or not this rule applies to us to ensure that we are not adulterating any of the products we're producing for U.S. commerce. So as far as who must comply, I mentioned in order to understand this, it's really important to understand the definitions and the terminology that's being used throughout that rule. So we'll start with a processor, which is in 123.3I or L. Processor is any person engaged in commercial, custom, or institutional processing of a fish or fishery product, whether they're in the US or a foreign country. So this doesn't apply just to our US or domestic production. Anything in market in the US must be produced in compliance with this regulation, regardless of where that processing takes place. All right, so it applies to processors. We also need to understand what processing entails with regards to the FDA's definition. So according to FDA, processing includes the handling, storing, preparing, heading, freezing, eviscerating, changing to different market forms, manufacturing, shucking, preserving, packing, labeling, dockside unloading, and holding of a fish or fishery product. So according to FDA, processing entails a lot more than you would traditionally think when you hear the word process or processing. So it's important to understand that this applies to pretty much anyone that's handling or working with seafood or fish or fishery products. The term fish is also used throughout the rule, so we need to understand what they mean when they say fish or state fish in that regulation. Fish, according to this rule, means fresh or saltwater finfish, crustaceans, mollusks, or any other forms of aquatic animal life, which can include alligators, frogs, turtles, jellyfish, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, and roe, other than birds or mammals. So really any animal life that lives all or part of its life in the water is typically fitting this definition of a fish. Right? So not necessarily what you typically think. So keeping that in mind when assessing whether or not this rule applies to you. Now I know there was a question about whether algae or seaweed products were fit under this definition. If you look at it, it really doesn't describe any kind of animal aquatic plants or algae. So they do not fit under the definition of a fish and therefore are not subject to the Seafood HACCP regulation. Seaweed was actually designated as a raw agricultural commodity a few years back by the FDA and thus is subject to the preventive controls for human foods rule. I've linked some resources here, the seaweed classification infographic that was developed by the National Sea Grant Law Center. That's a great infographic looking at how seaweed is classified in the US as a raw agricultural commodity and not actually as a seafood product. And the Seaweed Food Safety Guide is actually a regulatory guide that was developed to provide an overview or insight into the preventive controls rule, but also how that compares to the Seafood HACCP rule. Since right now, although federally it is regulated as a raw agricultural commodity under preventive controls, there are many states predating that designation that regulate seaweeds under HACCP. Right? So important to keep in mind. All right, the last definition we want to look at is the definition of a fishery product. So a fishery product, according to that rule, means any human food product in which fish is a characterizing ingredient. Right? That's all the clarification they really give on what a fishery product is. So ultimately, the way we interpret that, how we define a characterizing ingredient is one, if you are using that ingredient to characterize the food itself, like whitefish salad, crab dip, or fish sauce, it's considered a characterizing ingredient, regardless of how much of that ingredient is in that product. However, if you're doing products like Worcestershire or Caesar dressing, which both contain anchovies, but you're not using that ingredient to characterize it. It's also a minor ingredient in that product that would not be considered a fishery product and subject to the Seafood HACCP regulation. Also important to note, just because it's not subject to Seafood HACCP does not mean it's not regulated. It's just not regulated under this rule. All right, next, to fully understand who this applies to and who must comply with the Seafood HACCP rule, we need to understand those terms, but we also need to understand the exemptions that apply to different commodities or industries. So the exemptions are housed in 123.3, and they include harvesting as well as aquaculture producers, unless they themselves are involved in some form of processing. There are some processing operation or processing practices that can be considered exempt, such as heading, eviscerating, or freezing on a harvest vessel if it's intended solely for the purpose of holding that fish to get to land. Retail operations are exempt from the Seafood HACCP regulation and are regulated under the Food Code. And lastly, transportation is covered under a new FSMA transportation rule and and transporters are not subject to this rule as well. So that covers and hopefully gives you a better understanding of who this applies to and whether or not this applies to you. So now let's get into the starting off point with our hazard analysis. So where we go next in terms of developing those HACCP plans. So before you do that, you need to conduct this hazard analysis, which is essentially your risk assessment or risk evaluation portion of this process, where you identify the potential hazards that are associated with your product and determine which of those hazards are actually significant. The hazards that are significant are those that are most likely to occur within your operation, depending on the species you're working with and the processes you're using. And through that process, you're ultimately going to land on identification of critical control points or CCPs, where you can effectively control any of those significant hazards within your operation. So if we break this down, we start with assessing the risk at all steps in our process. This is a very basic flow of product through a facility. We start with receiving that product, we process, we package, and then we put that into refrigerated storage. So we want to make sure that we're assessing all the different steps in our process and assuring that we're observing and evaluating the risk associated with each of those steps for the products that we're producing. Next, you want to identify all the potential hazards that could be associated with that product based on the species itself, as well as the processes used to process them. You can do that using a variety of resources. The best and number one we often refer to is our agency guidance document, the Fish and Fishery Products Hazards and Controls Guide, often called our Seafood Hazards Guide that you see here. You can also refer to scientific publications and peer-reviewed resources that can help give us a better understanding of hazards and how we can control them. You can use product history and consumer complaints to get a sense of issues that are recurring within your operation and your products. You can talk to food safety experts around the country and use resources like the Seafood HACCP Alliance and their training program, which has access to a lot of additional training resources, tools, and experts. There is that live link here to the FDA Fish and Fishery Products Hazards and Controls Guide webpage, which is going to house the most recent version or updates to this guide, and make sure you're using that whenever you're conducting a hazard analysis or reassessing that. Next, what you're going to do once you've identified all those potential hazards is you need to assess each of those potential hazards at the different steps in your process to determine which are significant and where. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples of where you might find significant hazards and why you might consider them significant here. For example, at our receiving step, you may be sourcing species that are prone to histamine formation or scombrotoxin. And if temperature abuse occurs while that product is in transit to your facility, histamine could form in that product, rendering it unsafe. Right? Another example, if you have product in refrigerated storage, there could be the hazard of pathogenic growth due to temperature abuse, because temperature abuse during storage could allow for pathogens to grow, especially important if that is a ready-to-eat product. Lastly, we have an example here of parasites. Parasites could infect the human host if that product is not cooked properly to destroy them, so it's important to ensure that we're doing this so at that cook step. Once you've identified the hazards as significant, then you work towards identifying control measures for those hazards. So here's some examples for those different significant hazards we just explored. So in order to prevent temperature abuse to ensure histamine doesn't form in a project. A control measure might be to ensure proper temperature control or icing of product as it's coming into your facility. For refrigerated storage, to prevent pathogen growth due to temperature abuse, you might have a control measure in place to monitor and ensure that refrigeration temperatures are always maintained below 40 degrees. And lastly, for something like parasites, where they could infect that human host if not controlled, you can ensure that time temperature requirements for your cook step are met in order to effectively destroy those parasites and prevent harm during consumption. So ultimately, the important thing here is, and what you're really looking to gain out of this hazard analysis, is whenever you've identified a significant hazard, right, and you have identified a processing step within your operation where that control must be placed in order to prevent that hazard, those are your CCPs, or your critical control points. Those critical control points are the key piece of information that you're looking to get from that hazard analysis and pull out to move on to developing that HACCP plan. So let's explore the importance now and impact of that hazard analysis. So the effective hazard analysis is going to ensure that all of those CCPs are accurately identified, and those HACCP plans that you develop are built off of and around those critical control points, right? Missing any of those CCPs will result in an inaccurate HACCP plan and potential failure to control some of the hazards associated with your products and process, which could result in product recalls and foodborne illness. As for impacts of the inaccurate hazard analysis, well, ultimately, you're going to not be in compliance with the Seafood HACCP regulation, which could result in regulatory actions such as fines, import alerts, or recalls. This could result in economic loss in the form of those recalls and the loss of the product, and ultimately impact your brand and your identity, loss of trust from your consumer base, and reduction of sales, especially if you see these recurring issues with recalls. I want to touch on real quick the written hazard analysis. So I've pulled the language directly from the regulation 123.6a, which covers the hazard analysis. And it states that every processor shall conduct or have conducted for it a hazard analysis. It doesn't actually state that that hazard analysis must be written, right? So that is not a requirement of the rule. However, we highly recommend that you go through the steps in the process of writing this down, because there are many benefits to that. One, it's very challenging to do in your head without actually writing it down, especially for very complex processes. But you also have a record of the decisions you've made as you went through and did that assessment of your product. You then can easily recall the thought process and the reasons behind the decisions you made as to whether or not a hazard was significant and where those critical control points were within your process. You could have the added benefit of reducing the time that an inspector spends in your facility if you're able to provide answers quickly to questions that they might have, or even provide them a written hazard analysis so they don't even need to ask the questions of where these came from. It also can serve as a really great training tool for the industry to bring up to speed any new staff, especially on our safety teams, and ensure that you're easily able to update and reassess those plans annually or as needed, which is a requirement of the regulation. Last thing I want to touch on is that reassessment, right? You do need to reassess your HACCP plans, which might warrant the redoing of a hazard analysis at least annually. And this might happen anytime there's a change to a regulation or guidance, anytime you have a change in the product formulation or ingredients, or a change to the facilities and equipment itself. So for example, in November of 2024, FDA updated their compliance policy guide for strombrotoxin or histamine, and that might warrant the reassessment of a HACCP plan and the redoing of a hazard analysis. So I'll pass the screen to Eugene to give an update on these new histamine guidance.
Hello, everybody. My name is Eugene Evans, Supervising Inspector, New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. We're going to briefly go over the new histamine guidance by FDA and how we're handling things in New York State. Mike, could you switch to the next slide, please? All right, so if you click on that, that'll take us to the FDA link.
You seeing the link, Eugene?
I'm not seeing the link.
All right, I mean to re-share the whole screen. Hold on.
Okay. Okay, there we go. So now if you click on the download the final compliance policy guide, so this is where you're going to find what FDA published in relation to this. So this provides their scientific reasonings for reducing the histamine tolerance levels. So previously, for many years, it was 50 parts per million was the action level and 500 parts per million was considered a human health hazard. Now, that's been lowered to 35 parts per million as an action level and 200 parts per million as a human health hazard. Now, they also list in here decomposition. So decomposition plays a part in the development of histamine formation. And it explains all of their reasonings and their actions of how they're going to take action in relation to histamine and how many samples. So right now, if there's a lot taken, FDA will consider one sample, one subsample in a lot to be considered adulterated if it contains 35 parts per million of histamine. So everything that you would want to look at in terms of how it's going to be scored and where you would find it in the FD&C Act is going to be listed here in this document. So those of you out there that might be inspected by FDA and you want to see where this is going to be cited and the reasons why FDA inspectors are going to use certain regulatory citations, you'll find that here. So this is a very good read to sit down, and it's a good idea to make a copy of this and keep it for yourself. Because it explains the science and the reasonings behind why this was done to correlate with other countries on Earth. So now what we did in New York State, we developed a smaller document which sort of summarizes things because we also inspect retail establishments and we have retail under our jurisdiction. So we came up with something for that. Now, the first link shows you where you would find that. We're in the process of developing a seafood page on our New York State Department of Agriculture Markets website. So this is all the way at the bottom. So I just wanted to show you where you would find this on the licensing page. It's way down at the bottom. So this is the initial screen that you would find it. It's in food business licensing right now temporarily. Okay, so when you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see that. There you go. Okay, so that's where you would look for that here. So that's where you would find it. And when you click on it, that would be the next link. So this will be the actual document that was developed for both wholesale and retail establishments falling under jurisdiction of New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. Okay, so here we go. So what we did here is we just gave a brief explanation of obviously 35 parts per million. Now, if sensory analysis detects evidence of decomposition, that's a whole different issue. And right now, New York State does not do sensory analysis. That would go to FDA for sensory analysis. And obviously, if product testing reveals a presence of 200 parts per million or more of histamine, both of them will be considered recalls. So they'll both be considered class 2 recalls, but 200 parts per million is going to be considered a human health hazard. Okay, and that's a very interesting point because now we know that it's hazardous to human health. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're advising everybody of this. This way people could take the necessary steps to ensure proper sanitation, ensure temperature control, tightening up procedures that you have to make sure that you minimize any potential risks of forming histamine, because it's not that difficult under adverse conditions to quickly get to 35 parts per million. So we want to make sure that everybody's aware of this so they could take the necessary steps ahead of time to prevent having unnecessary recalls, unnecessary decomposed fish, and unnecessary problems associated with the higher levels of histamine. So this document, Mike, if you scroll down a little bit within the document. Okay, so what we're doing is we're providing wholesalers, obviously, are going to be need to be in compliance with the relevant sections of 21 CFR 117 That is the preventive controls regulation. So that would be subpart A, B, and F for establishments operating under Seafood HACCP. And obviously 21 CFR 123, which is the Seafood HACCP regulations. Now, our retail establishments, they're going to be following the current retail food regulations. Okay, so that's currently Circular 962, which is a food code-like regulation. And then we have Circular 1032. So those are the rules and regulations relating to fish processing and smoking establishments. That's where applicable. So if you're not doing any curing or smoking or anything like that, that wouldn't apply, but you would still be operating under the retail food store regulations. And it's important to comply with those regulations to ensure that you're maintaining your fish under temperature controlled conditions to prevent histamine formation. Okay. Now, Mike, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so a very large issue that we see at retail is unrefrigerated unrefrigerated displays of fish without adequate ice. Now, if you have a refrigerated case that's fully enclosed and the temperature is controlled and it's well below 41 degrees, you're generally not going to have a lot of problems in relation to temperature issues. Okay, where the problems come in is going to be the exposed displays where you have fish sitting on top of ice, sitting out in direct sunlight, maybe possibly sitting outside on a sidewalk style display. This is where your problems come in. So retailers who are using these types of displays, because maybe the neighborhood that you in, people prefer to buy it, displayed like that, obviously you want to take additional steps to ensure that your fish, all parts of your fish, are maintained well below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. So how you set up your displays, if you have a foot of ice and then a foot of fish sitting on top of the ice, maybe your first inch or two of fish that's in contact with the ice will maintain a colder temperature. But under direct sunlight, if it's a heated facility, if it's warm outside, or if it's, the upper layers are going to rise pretty quickly, well above 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And we see this a lot on inspections. Now, what this also contributes is to premature decomposition, where you're seeing fish decomposing at retail. That's something that you want to minimize, and it's something that can be clearly prevented by maintaining a proper display. So obviously, if you have fish fully surrounded by ice, or if you have ice above your fish where the cold vapor from melting ice can settle over the surface of your fish, so you have cool vapor over the top of your fish and then direct contact with ice underneath, these are things that you could use, whether or not you have fans blowing that have, chilled air blowing over your fish. There's many ways that you could maintain temperature of your fish and keep your fish in pristine condition. Another thing that you really want to do with these types of displays is make sure your ice is clean. So taking down your ice from these cases, mostly it's the best to do it as best practices on a daily basis, clean and sanitize the entire unit. And then in the morning, when the establishment opens up again, replace that ice, replace your fish, put your fish out, stack everything up, and then set it up properly. This way you have clean ice with all your fish being displayed under sanitary conditions, and then display them properly chilled with a proper ice setup. So you doing these things are going to help, obviously, reduce premature decomposition, which can relate to histamine formation and histamine forming species, but it could also reduce histamine formation, which is what we really want to do over the shelf life of that fish. So that's going to minimize potential illnesses. Obviously, it could, minimize recalls and various consumer complaints. So it just benefits everybody. Everybody wins. The consumers win, establishments win. Obviously, the regulators were all happy to see something like that. It's just a best practice that really needs to be tightened up, especially with histamine tolerance levels being reduced. So obviously, this is, we don't have a lot of time to go over this and show different types of displays and discussions. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I'll be more than happy to go over this with you if you have any questions. But other than that, I think we pretty much got through histamine, and I guess we could take questions.
Okay, thank you guys for the presentation.